with and to network with those policymakers that are working on the issues that you're interested in. The context of policymaking is critical to the use or otherwise of organized knowledge. And whereas in idealized science, we believe our findings are universally applicable, it turns out that when we work in a policy area and we do research on policy problems, that universal applicability is very questionable, and we'll see why. One of the big major themes in EVP promotion is the notion that randomized controlled tests are the best possible way of assuring the validity of a particular treatment or a particular proposition. I'm not questioning that. The evidence does, the researchers do not question this in relation to something like the practice of clinical medicine. That's not the issue. But when you get a complex policy problem involving collective activities and interests, the RCTs turn out not to provide the kind of assurance that the believers in this credo suggests, right? So there is not a hierarchy of evidence that can be mechanically adopted by the naive, although you'll see a lot of literature to that effect. This oversimplifies the task of providing policy-relevant evidence. It fails to understand that the differences between application A in location A prime and application B in location B prime are much more complex than the randomized controlled trials carried out in A are likely to be able to capture. So this is Susan Cartwright, who's a very important philosopher of science at the London School of Economics, and she's done a lot of work on RCTs as validating evidence, and she says the answer is, well, okay, external validity can be expected if the target population is sufficiently similar to the study population. She says in policymaking, you're lucky if this gets you anywhere. You're lucky if it gets you anywhere. And so we have to pay attention to local context, lay knowledge, political demands. I mean, in classic philosophy of science, the ceteris paribus assumptions are very, very hard to respect in complex policy problems. So, some preliminary conclusions. This is Carol Weiss, the late Carol Weiss was probably the leading researcher in knowledge utilization at the Harvard School of Education, and worked in education and health in a whole range of areas. Research doesn't win victories in the absence of a social and political process that supports it, right? And most policy research is going to go by the board. I mean, none of us in academic life are surprised about that because we know how much gets published and how much of an impact it has. This is just to give you a sample. There's another, I didn't put it in here, but there are 2 or 3 cases where these researchers have laid out and said, well, here's all the contingencies that have to work together in order for research to apply effectively in this context, and here's hers. I'm not going to go through it, but you can see that it's a pretty serious and demanding set of requirements for this evidence to work in the policy process. So what's the difference between reinforce and reform? Well, reformers, unlike the reinforce movement, which you'll recall are the strong proponents of EBP who think that the government ought to get with the program, reformers accept the failure of what an Australian scholar says, Brian Head says, traditional science transmission model. They accept that this has failed, this doesn't work. Academic knowledge producers disseminate their scientific findings and expect others to recognize the superior merit of their work. It does not work in the way of EBP. You need a stronger, more organic and sustained relationship between the researcher and the potential client in the policymaking apparatus for the scientific findings to be useful. So I've laid out a series of findings by the researchers on evidence-based policy, and you as a researcher can choose to be a reformer, reinventor, rejecter by depending how much improvement or amelioration of those challenges you think can be accomplished, right? So if you're a reformer, you say, well, we're partway there. You know, we're starting to understand how these problems can be managed. One, we should stop the notion that we're going to hand a package of research to someone and they're going to solve a policy. It's going to drive a policy change. That's not the way it works. We should accept that what we want to do is make policymakers help them to be more sophisticated, help them to stay aware of the latest research, help them to understand that we're there as a resource for them so that they can be more enlightened in their approach to the policy problems. It's not a mechanical process, it's kind of an organic process. Secondly, we have to accept that randomized controlled trials, notwithstanding the propaganda, are not the gold standard for policymaking because there are too many auxiliary hypotheses, ceteris paribus conditions, which have to be exhaustively explored before we transfer the policy from place A to place B. And third, well, I've mentioned this already, we have to have sustained contact. Okay? These are the fundamentals that I see coming out of the broad range of research on evidence-based policy. These are the fundamental lessons. Right? So that's what the Reform School says. If we work with this, this is the best way to improve, and we think that we can change different aspects of current relationships in such a way as to foster a greater and more successful transfer of knowledge from the research world to the policy world. The reInvent people say that's not enough. We can't just sort of tweak the process. We have to make some fundamental changes. And we have to do it in a formal, explicit way in government, because we need a new form of governance of evidence in policymaking. Okay, what's meant? Now, I'm going to start here to put a lot of quotes on the screen. I'm putting them on there because I want you to get the sense that this isn't me, this is actually the research that's being done by the people themselves. I want you to get a flavor of what they're saying. So, if we're interested in the role that knowledge ought to play in policy, we want to know how it's produced, what it consists of, how real and potential disagreements are managed, and what forms of evidence are acceptable in pluralistic societies. This is epistemic governance, that's Raman's word. Okay? We want to know how this process works in detail. And we probably, then, are going to have to create formal systems, explicitly create an ideal type of evidence-based policy, so that we know that we've explained to policymakers how they ought to operate. So we're going to have formal evidence systems, and they're going to tell us who has the right to speak on expert matters, when and for which sorts of decisions evidence will be invoked, where budgets will be utilized, etc., etc. Quite a demanding auto-regulation. This is a situation where governments are telling themselves how their policies should be developed, telling their own people, this is how you go about developing policy, and we're going to have formal systems, and this is the system you have to adhere to. So this really, I thought of this as it's the way we now consider immigration applications or asylum claims, which have to be documented because they're judicially reviewable. So we're going to have to document the policymaking process under this regime, right? Policymakers have to document so that they are in compliance with evidence system requirements. And the emphasis here then is how we go about doing it as opposed to what the outcome might be. This would be a pretty big change in the way policy is currently made. I won't go further into that. Carol Weiss, who's done more research on the ground in studying how evidence is used in policymaking and evaluation, says people can't tell you what studies they used, even when they did use studies. The reject school. I'm getting through, there's going to be a lot of questions, Paul. I'm sorry, I'm running hard. I'm going faster than I expected to go. The reject school says you can't meet the disciplinary standards and be policy useful because the problems of policy are too complex. And the distinction between evidence and policy making collapses in the face of the fact that science is part of a complex social and political system. And it is morally embedded, or it's embedded in a series of processes which are eminently human, and it displays the same strengths and flaws as other human activities. Something needs evaluation. So the claim that EBP can offer a counter to the politics and policymaking therefore fails because the politics in question is constitutive of democratic public life. So what do we mean by complexity? Well, a complex world is a world that doesn't return to the mean, doesn't revert to the mean. A world that features nonlinear dynamics, path dependency, institutional lock-in, etc., etc. These are things which contemporary scientific standards have difficulty coping with. We could talk, I mean, I'm not an expert on complexity, but the people who are experts on complexity say we don't have the complex mathematics and the techniques required to tame this world in the way that, that will produce the kind of valid knowledge that science claims to produce, that classical science claims to produce. So we could talk more about that at some point, but the strong argument is by the people who study complexity in public policy that we don't have the techniques, we're not there yet, but that is nevertheless is how the world actually is working. This is why we have some of the frustrations we have in the way of policymaking. This is William Byers. He's a retired mathematics professor from Concordia who wrote a book for Princeton University Press. I don't think anyone's read it but me, but it's, I think, a very good book. He says the world is so complex, we crave certainty, we create our scientific models, and because we crave certainty, we say that is where we take the models for reality. And there's information, but we make excessive claims about the validity of the methods that we currently have, right? We oversell them. And that is not helpful because it simply gets us frustrated about our inability to use this allegedly certain knowledge in constructive ways for society. The idea that science will inevitably save us from ideology is itself an ideology. So what we have to do, according to these experts, is this school, the Reject School, says we have to accept that the control of a complex society like ours is not possible. So we go from, this is the terrific metaphor, the image here, the policy metaphor in the complexity frame changes from an image of government behind a steering wheel driving on a well-lit road to an image of government trying to drive a car with the windshield covered in mud going down an unlit, winding road with hundreds of people grabbing the wheel. And honestly, having been in government, that's a much better image than the clear drive down the road with all the lights and so forth, okay? I mean, the hundreds of people grabbing the wheel is a particularly appropriate analogy or image. So they say, in this frame, you know, it's not about scientific models. Ultimately, policy is about touch, feel, intuition. A lot of people would say political judgment. Too many variables are interacting, too many random events for anyone to predict adequately. So what we're going to get from theory or from science is less than we'd hoped for. And the process is going to be messier. So the Reject School goes on to say, well, these problems are perhaps insurmountable. Attempting to calculate the richest diversity of the multiple components contributing to social systems change likely a hopeless endeavor. We have to drop the myth of rationality and recognize that technical issues are the same as any other policy issue. Right, I've said this already. So, and finally, this is the logical conclusion of the Reject School. This is an Australian political theorist. He said we've got to embrace failure and accept that most of the things we do go awry. And we've got to relinquish the illusion that we have an intellectual control on the natural, on social and natural phenomena, and accept that we don't know what's going to happen. We accept the unknowability of outcomes. This frees political argument from a hostage to fortune's successful outcomes, which discredits the whole of democratic politics. I mean, what he's saying here, well, in Eastern Europe, in communist Eastern Europe, they used to say, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. And what Little is saying here is, political actors should stop pretending to know so that citizens can stop pretending to believe them. And accept that we're coping with a much more complicated and difficult world than we pretend, and that our search for certainty leads us into a kind of illusion about our ability to control events. So Sir Peter Gluckman spoke here a couple of weeks ago. He's the science advisor to the government of New Zealand. He's also probably the sort of leader of the global science advisory community. He says, beware of hubris. And there's a lot, I mean, I've got, in my paper, I have about 7 or 8 citations where the people who studied evidence-based policy say, let's be modest. Let's have a little humility, right? Let's be honest about how little we can actually offer instead of over-claiming. The reinforced school doesn't read this literature, doesn't pay any attention to it, so they go on oblivious to the evidence on EBP. In the Reform and Reinvent School, they agree that the search for evidence-informed policy and practice will be a long and arduous journey. And the Reinvent School, which is a little more critical, would agree with Pawson, there's no such thing as evidence-based policy. Evidence is the six-stone weakling of the policy world. That's it. I could have given you the benefit of the other 7 or 8 slides at the rate I was going, but anyway, it leaves us more time to discuss.
All right, great. Thank you very much. That was very good. And I think there's a lot of material there for questions, so I'm hopeful that the audience will pose some. So we'll open up to the floor, and why don't you just take them? And
yeah, I think that's the best thing to do. You don't have to,
yeah.
just make sure I don't miss anybody.
Sure.
Yeah.